deeply personal accounts from authors representing diverse backgrounds and perspectives, both of Ashkenazi or European Jews and of Sephardi Mizrahi or Oriental Jews of Arab or Near Eastern origin. The contributors are rabbis, professors of Jewish studies and Middle Eastern studies, other academics, journalists and media specialists, lawyers, health professionals, social workers, activists, and recent graduates. They range in age from people in their 70s, like me, to those in their 20s, like Chris. I divided the book into 5 chapters: Rabbinic Voices, Transformative Experiences in Israel-Palestine, Voices from the Campuses, Progressive Values versus Zionism, and Reflections of Leading Organizers. In addition to collecting and editing the narratives, I wrote an introduction and afterword to put them into a broader context. The introduction provides a brief history of Zionism and anti-Zionism from 1880 to 1948, and the afterword traces American Jews' changing attitudes toward Israel from 1948 to 2018. I will now read extracts from the introduction and the afterword. Most people don't realize that American Jewish leaders began speaking out against Zionist aims and ideology very early, soon after Britain issued the 1917 Balfour Declaration, promising to establish a homeland, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. In March 1919, on the eve of the post-World War I Paris Peace Conference, Julius Kahn, the German-born Jewish congressman from San Francisco, delivered to President Wilson a statement to the peace conference endorsed by 299 Jews. The document denounced the Zionists for attempting to segregate Jews and to reverse the historical trend toward emancipation. Its signers objected to the creation of a distinctly Jewish state in Palestine, not only because they feared it would jeopardize the status of Jews like themselves in their home countries, but because they found it, quote, contrary to the principles of democracy, end quote, to elevate Jewish immigrants over Palestine's Muslim and Christian native inhabitants. They explicitly denied the existence of ethnic ties among Jews and asserted their wish not to see Palestine, quote, either now or at any time in the future, end quote, become a Jewish state. They petitioned instead for Palestine to be made into an independent, free, and democratic state that would not recognize any distinctions of creed, race, or ethnic descent among its citizens. American Jews' public agitation against Zionism continued when in 1922, the US Congress debated the American equivalent of the Balfour Declaration, the Lodge-Fish Resolution, which eventually passed. Testifying before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Rabbi David Phillipson emphasized that, quote, Zionists do not speak for all Jews. He particularly rejected the characterization of Palestine as the national home of the Jewish people. Quote, no land can be spoken of as the national home of the Jewish people, he countered, as Jews are nationals of many lands. Phillipson articulated the philosophy of Reform Judaism, which had repudiated the religious premises of Zionism decades before the birth of the Zionist movement. Contrasting Reform Judaism with Zionism, Phillipson wrote, quote, Reform Judaism is spiritual, Zionism is political. Reform Judaism is universal, Zionism is particularistic. Reform Judaism looks to the future, Zionism to the past. I will now read the last 3 paragraphs of my afterword. The narratives presented in this book defy stereotypes of both a monolithic pro-Israel Jewish community and a ragtag band of self-hating Jews outside it. On the contrary, they reveal that many who now reject Zionism do so out of deeply held religious values and remain observant Jews, while others take pride in a secular Jewish identity intertwined with their progressive ideals. As diverse as they are, these narratives share some common threads, pointing to 5 main reasons why their authors have ceased to identify themselves as Zionists. First, those who have witnessed the Israeli occupation firsthand have learned that a state run by Jews for Jews and dependent on maintaining a Jewish majority cannot guarantee either physical safety or spiritual wholeness for Jews. Indeed, that such a state must necessarily be an ethnocracy rather than a democracy. Second, those who have formed warm relationships with Palestinians, whether as college classmates, partners in coalitions for justice, or hosts during trips to the region, have overcome a major obstacle to envisioning a future in which Jews and Palestinians can live harmoniously together as equals. Third, those who have attended Jewish day school, Hebrew school, and Zionist summer camp, especially when they have taken seriously the commitment to social justice fostered by their Jewish education, have sooner or later recognized the contradiction between that commitment and Israel's cruel treatment of Palestinians. Once they applied to Israel the critical thinking they had been taught to consider the essence of Judaism, they came up against the censorship and silencing necessary to preserve faith in Israel as a democratic haven for the Jews, and in Zionism as a central tenet of Judaism. Fourth, the blatant discrimination that Sephardi Mizrahi Jews have confronted has exposed the falsity of Zionism's promises. In the words of contributor Shoshana Madmoni Gerber, quote, "The Zionist relation to Mizrahim carries a history of oppression and deceit, making the inclusion of Mizrahim possible only on the condition that they remain subordinate to Ashkenazi power and hate their identities and their cultures," end quote. Fifth, secular Jewish progressives have typically begun to question Zionism when they have discovered that the racial equality and religious tolerance they uphold in the US are not practiced in Israel, and that Israel has joined the US in supporting the reactionary regimes against which progressives have fought in Vietnam, South Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. For many, rejecting Zionism has entailed alienating family members, losing friends, and enduring expulsion from Jewish communal spaces. In compensation, however, dissenting Jews have found new spiritual homes in Open Hillel, If Not Now, Jewish Voice for Peace, and non-Zionist Havarot and Minyans, informal prayer groups that have been springing up around the country. These alternative spiritual communities have been infusing new meaning into ancient Jewish rituals of Kaddish, Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Passover, among others. Liberated from the need to defend the morally indefensible in the name of keeping the Jews safe, a safety that has proved dubious at best, dissenters can now ask forgiveness during Yom Kippur for the crimes committed against Palestinians, and prospectively celebrate freedom during Passover for all the victims of Zionism, Palestinians, Mizrahi Jews, and even the Israeli settlers and soldiers whose souls have become so twisted by fighting for dominance. Above all, the rediscovery of a Jewish diasporic tradition of what Rabbi Brant Rosen calls worldwide spiritual peoplehood can provide a foundation for solidarity with the oppressed everywhere that can make Jews better partners with others in the struggle for universal freedom, justice, and equality. Thank you. So let me now introduce my co-panelists. First, Emily Siegel. Emily Siegel is Program Director at Eyewitness Palestine. She holds a BA in International Relations with minors in Jewish Studies and Sociology from the University of Delaware, and an MA in International Peace and Conflict Resolution from American University's School of International Service. Please welcome Emily Siegel.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thanks so much for having us. I know it's been a little bit of a challenge, but we're really excited to finally get to meet with you. Can you all hear me okay? I know sometimes my microphone seems soft. Okay, great. So I'm going to be reading from my chapter, which is called Finding Community and the Right Pair of Glasses. And I'll start and then get into a little bit more of an introduction, because the first paragraph is a bit of an introduction to me already. So I work to encourage, facilitate, and support travel to Palestine, Israel by individuals in the US. These trips take visitors to the historical and religious sites, yes, but also help them dig deeper, learn more about the realities on the ground, truly understand the ways in which the systems of oppression by the Israeli government have affected this holy land, and most importantly, learn more about the creative and resilient ways Palestinians are working to change the status quo. I've served as program director of Eyewitness Palestine, formerly known as Interfaith Peace Builders, for almost 10 years now, and find myself every day feeling lucky to be doing something I care so passionately about, and knowing that the work I'm doing affects so many. Still, when I was denied entry by the Israeli Border Authority for this exact work in April 2018, I was surprised, and so were many around me. How is it that I spent the year leading up to my 21st birthday enjoying life within Israeli society, studying and partying at Ben Gurion University, and then spent my 35th birthday held for hours in a detention center at Ben Gurion Airport before being flown back to the US? How did I go from the lowest security threat, where I was welcomed upon arrival at the airport and walked around baggage scans by airport security upon exit because such inspection wasn't needed for me, to being labeled a public safety and security threat and banned for at least 5 years? Is my transformation that threatening? Is wanting peace with justice so scary? So it took me a while to write my narrative, and Carolyn had to do a lot of pushing on me, and it really wasn't until after I was denied entry that I spent time writing this chapter. In a lot of ways, it was the first time that I felt like I had time to do so, and I had 3 weeks that I was supposed to be traveling in Israel and Palestine, and so my calendar was totally empty. But also, I think that I was really doing some introspective work of thinking about what does make me so threatening, because I don't find myself to be a very threatening individual, and I don't think my work should be either. And during my interrogation, the Israeli Border Authority spent a lot of time going through all of the times that I'd been there previously, which the first time that I was there was in 2000, where I spent 6 weeks traveling as a teenager there. And I'll just say a little bit about my own background. I grew up in a relatively typical secular Jewish family in Washington, D.C. And in a lot of ways, I found my connection during and through my connection to Judaism through my connection with Israel. And so this trip that I took when I was about 16, 17 for 6 weeks really played a huge role in my life. We spent time visiting historical sites that are important to Judaism, hiking and seeing the beauty of the country, and really the trip's goal was to connect us as Jewish people to our land. But during this time, we never really talked about the political issues that were happening there until the last night. And the last night of the trip, we went out to dinner at a very fancy restaurant that happened to be behind the Prime Minister's house at the time. And when we left the restaurant, there was a huge protest happening. And I'll just read a little bit about that protest and my sort of understanding of it. While we waited for the Prime Minister to come speak, we were surrounded by people chanting and singing. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I remember feeling a deep sense of belonging. more so than during any other part of the trip. There seemed to be so much hope and excitement in the air. It felt like something I wanted to be a part of. During the entire trip, we had never talked about the current political climate. It wasn't relevant to our journey we were on, which served to connect us to our community and to the land. That night, my last night in Israel, I returned to the hotel and wrote in my journal, which I still have today, that my life had changed at that peace rally. I had to find a way to be involved in this struggle for peace, and I couldn't see myself going forward without being a part of it. That trip left me with a profound sense of connection to Israel and a desire to help bring about the peace that people were calling for that night. So after that, I went into my senior year of high school. I was in an international studies program at Wilson, and I had to do a sort of senior project, which I did on Israel-Palestine, and came up with a lot of solutions for it that now I don't think could ever happen. But it really set me on a path to learn more. And that ended up leading me in college to go to Ben Gurion University for a semester, where I lived with Israelis and traveled all around Israel. I took intensive courses on Israeli society from an Israeli perspective, but I also ended up volunteering at a Bedouin school, which was only about 10 minutes from the university that I was in, but really was a very different world. So I'm going to just read a very short piece of that. I would travel every day with a teacher that I was helping, and she would explain what it felt like to live in an unrecognized village, in a place that she called home, but which had been robbed of everything that really felt like home. Learning from her and visiting her village prompted me to begin asking questions about the lack of electricity, plumbing, or medical services in an area so close to where I was living in comfort when my time studying abroad ended. When my time studying abroad ended, I was determined to learn more about this, but had few ideas about how to do so or where to go with my questions. And I really returned from that time. This was the first time that sort of these cracks in this Israel as a utopian society started to occur for me. But I went back to my university, and I feel like the people that I went to ask questions didn't necessarily give me answers that really got to the root of the problem. And I re-immersed myself in university at that time, but I also missed my time in Israel. And so that led me to actually being a part of the pro-Israel group at my university. And within a few months, I was also elected president of that pro-Israel group. And I was paid by AIPAC to come back to DC for their conferences, and really submerge myself in that area. But all along, both my love for Israel, but also my commitment for peace, led me back there after university. And I participated in a social justice program that part of it, that after half a year of studying, you then got an internship. And so I got an internship with a youth organization in Jerusalem that worked to bring Palestinian and Israeli children from Jerusalem to America for a camp. And at that time, my role was actually to interview Palestinian children to test their English skills. So I'll just read a little bit about that. I decided to ask them each the same question. If you could tell an Israeli anything about your life, what would it be? What I heard that day, my first day, and in many interviews to come, was heartbreaking and something that I could not ignore. I was told about the checkpoints many of them had to go through to get to school, about life in refugee camps, about the Nakba and what their grandparents had experienced, about their fathers who were currently in prison. I was told about their wishes for peace, to be able to travel to Jerusalem to pray, or just to play with their friends that they could no longer see. The stories went on, and as each child spoke to me, I kept asking myself, how could I have gone so long without knowing any of this? I knew these weren't made up stories because a 12-year-old has no inclination to be disingenuous, and none of them were aware of how little I really knew about what they were telling me. By the end of that first day, after returning to Jerusalem through my first checkpoint, I had a very different understanding from what I was seeing around me. It was as if something had been missing from my education all my life. Why had I never been exposed to the realities I had just witnessed? Was my community, my university, trying to keep this from me? I was very lucky after that time and after being exposed to so many new ideas and understandings to return to DC to an internship and my master's program at American University. And it was a very supportive environment where I was able to ask a lot of these questions and actually get really amazing answers. I had amazing peers and mentors that really taught me a lot during that time. And I really was basically able to get sort of that academic backing that upheld the experiences that I just had and made those experiences fit a little bit better into what the reality of things going on there were. So I'll sort of end where I began, in how writing this narrative allowed me to look back at why Israel is so threatened by me now and where I am today. Now that I can look back at this part of my life, I see that this transformation was in some ways natural for me. What I was seeing and learning related to many things that were happening around me. My parents and grandparents had been involved in politics, desegregation, and labor work. I had grown up within diverse communities and had learned about inequality. How could I not understand quickly and want to learn more when confronted with similar issues taking place somewhere else? Moving away from people I'd become close to through the Jewish community was hard. To this day, I still have to confront questions and arguments from longtime friends I met during these programs. How could you think this way? You lived there, you know the truth, they would say. My answer is always the same. I found the right pair of glasses, which allowed me to see the reality, not just the truth that the community I'd surrounded myself with wanted me to see. I found a new community, one that resembled the one I grew up in, diverse, compassionate, lively, and incredibly powerful. If this means that Israel now sees me as a threat and doesn't want me to visit, then I'm fine with that. In many ways, I understand why I would be threatening to the Israeli government. I have a background that would seem to lead to conclusions about Israel's right to exist as it is today. Yet my path led me to believe something very different is possible and is necessary. What the exact solution is not for me to define, but I will continue to be vocal about insisting that the world push to bring something new about. I still believe in and fight for peace, just as I did as a teenager at the end of that teen tour. However, today I understand that peace cannot come without justice, and that it must bring freedom, justice, and equality for us all, not just some. I am also proud to proclaim that I am anti-Zionist. As such, I believe that solidarity is the true path to safety and liberation for everyone, and that it offers the only way for us to fight against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of white supremacy. I still have a lot to learn, and through my work and my friends, find myself doing so every day. I confront my privilege as a white Jewish American from a middle-class family almost daily. I try to expand the ways in which I connect the things I grew up around in the US to what I understand about Palestine and vice versa. I continue to read and expand my understanding of oppressive systems and how they affect the world we live in. I learn lessons of resistance and persistent struggle from Palestinians, both in Palestine and in the US, every single day. Most importantly, I continue to immerse myself in communities that uphold the same values of justice that I hold. Communities I continue to learn from, and that I hope may sometimes learn something from me. I'm grateful for the path that I've been on and where I've ended up. It's created a world around me that, while filled with frustrations and sadness, is even more so filled with love and kindness, strength and powerful voices, and most of all, beauty in so many forms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Now, Chris Godshall will speak. Chris holds a BA from Columbia University in Political Science and Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. He is currently attending Georgetown University Law Center, hoping to work on civil and human rights. Please welcome Chris Godshall.
Thanks, Carolyn. Can you guys all hear me? Yeah, good.
Yes.
So I usually, it's funny, I always begin, we always like say the title of our chapter, and I always joke at these events that Carolyn also had to sort of push me to submit my chapter on time. I was very, very late. And I guess I forgot to change, I had it like a stock title saved on my computer, and I forgot to change it. So it just says My Journey from Zionism to Anti-Zionism, which is a little on the nose and not very creative. So like if I could go back, I would actually rename it My Life as a Jew Named Christopher, because obviously that's not a traditional Jewish name. And I'm actually really excited to speak to you guys. This is our second time speaking to a church group, because my father is Christian and my mother is Jewish. And it's a confusing and yet beautiful way to grow up. But it really animates a lot of my journey in regards to Israel and Palestine, because as I got older, when I was young, my dad's beliefs really dominated my upbringing. But as I got older, I became more interested in exploring my mother's heritage. I started engaging a lot more with my mom's side of the family, and really started to sort of own my identity as a Jew. And now I kind of like solidly identify as half Jewish, and I think that like more people should do that if they are half Jewish, because it's a fraught issue in the Jewish community, but that's a separate question. But all of this led me, when I turned around when I was like at the end of my almost at my 19th birthday, when I was at Columbia, to attend a birthright trip. And if you don't know what birthright is, it's a program that allows basically Jews in their early 20s or around that age to go to Israel for 10 days for free, absolutely free. So I signed up thinking, what better place to explore my Jewish heritage than at the Jewish state. So I'll begin my narrative at that event. Shortly before my 19th birthday in June 2011, I left for Israel with a group of 20 or so complete strangers. Israel, or at least the parts birthright shows you, is beautiful. We visited Caesarea, Tiberias, Tel Aviv, and of course, Jerusalem. I spent my birthday in a Tel Aviv bar and prayed at the Western Wall in the Old City. I toured Yad Vashem and climbed Masada for an improvised bar mitzvah at the top to make up for the one I'd never had. It was a great time, but not even the rosy picture painted by birthright can totally obscure the not-so-picturesque reality of Israel. Two things stick in my memory as having triggered a sort of, that doesn't really match what they're telling me thought. The first occurred at the border of Israel and Lebanon at a kibbutz we visited. A resident of the kibbutz, an older American man who had moved to Israel a few decades before, spoke to us all in a room overlooking southern Lebanon. I don't remember everything he said, but two things stand out. First, I noticed his shirt. It was very, very disturbing. It listed all of the failed genocides of the Jewish people and their dates. It started with the attempt by Haman in the story of Esther and ended with Iran, ? If his choice of apparel didn't hint at the sort of attitude he had, his talk made it very clear. The second thing I remember is something he said about how he would do anything to defend Israel and the Jewish people. To paraphrase, it was something along the lines of, even the women and children of Lebanon are guilty of crimes against Israel, and I would shoot anyone who came at that border, even a child. I and a few other participants were justifiably appalled. When we left, the tour guide explained it away as a fringe attitude in Israel born of fear and conflict. Another thing I remember as having made me question the narrative of birthright was the site of East Jerusalem. In hindsight, it's clear to me how much is hidden from birthright participants. nothing more so than evidence of the occupation of Palestine. I saw East Jerusalem while climbing a very steep hill as we walked back from the City of David Archaeological Park. Unlike the western part of the city, East Jerusalem is visibly impoverished and underdeveloped. I knew, of course, about Palestine and the occupation, and even questioned its legitimacy in conversations on the subject. But like many others, I accepted it all the same. To see it in person, however, drove those questions to the forefront of my mind, and eventually forced me to see Israel in a different light. I came home from my 10-day trip with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I, for lack of a better term, felt Jewish for the first time in my life. I went to Israel and was told over and over again that I had a place there and in the larger Jewish community. On the other hand, I wasn't sure that the arguments and justifications for the more questionable things I saw were sufficient. So at this point, this was entering my summer, the summer before my sophomore year in college. And I really didn't engage very much that year. And I sort of I focused on school and other things. But my junior year, the summer after my junior year, I actually had the opportunity to live in Jordan. And I was working for a startup there. And so while I was in Jordan, a few friends and I decided that we were going to go back to Israel-Palestine. This time we crossed the land border, which I don't recommend doing. It's not a pleasant experience, from Jordan at the Allenby border crossing. This was in 2014 during Operation Protective Edge in Gaza, where Israel was just destroying Gaza, or what was left of it from the previous attacks. It was very, very tense. We had to sign like a waiver that we were going, and Colombia was not responsible for anything that happened to us. It was very crazy. I did not tell my mom I was going because she would not have been pleased. It was a lot. But I was really determined while I was there to do a sort of anti-birthright, like sort of see the things that they didn't show me. So I'll read a little bit more about that because that was another major sort of turning point, and sort of what stimulated my more active participation in anti-Zionist advocacy. The two most important experiences I had while exploring Palestine were my tour with the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions and walking through the military checkpoints to enter Ramallah and Bethlehem. The ICAD, the committee, tour included a stop at demolished homes in East Jerusalem, a visit to an Israeli settlement, and a look at the, quote, separation barrier, and a climb up a hill to get a bird's eye view of the occupation. The demolished home had been torn down a few weeks prior to our visit because its owners did not have the appropriate permits. Among the piles of debris were food items and children's toys. This was contrasted with our next stop, a gated Israeli community built, I imagine, on the foundations of other demolished homes, and certainly without a permit. Our next stop, the wall, was taller than I had imagined and far more dystopian, complete with barbed wire and watchtowers. I'm honestly not sure how anyone can call it a security fence with a straight face. Our tour ended with a view of it all, with particular emphasis on the plot of land slated for settlement that, if developed, would totally separate Jerusalem from the Palestinian territories. After the ICAD tour, my friends and I went on self-organized trips to places in Jerusalem and the nearby cities. These included day trips to Ramallah and Bethlehem. Traveling to either city requires passing through a military checkpoint. These checkpoints are large facilities where Israeli border personnel inquire about the purpose of your travel and check your paperwork. As Americans, we did not have much trouble passing through either checkpoint, but nevertheless, we got a glimpse of the inconvenience and humiliation that being herded through a checkpoint provides. The Ramallah checkpoint was the worst of the two. Our time in the facility on the way back to Jerusalem took more than an hour, its length caused by a combination of crowdedness and staff negligence. We entered via a roughly 6-foot-high wired roof tunnel to be waved through a turnstile. This tunnel was stuffed with people, and the young soldier meant to be waving people through was not paying attention, allowing it to grow more and more crowded. Finally, as people began to yell to get his attention, he realized we were waiting and let people through. We then met with heavily armed soldiers on the other side of a thick pane of glass to have our passports or permits checked. The difference between our treatment and that of the Palestinian travelers stands out in my memory. The Palestinians were hurried along and yelled at, but when our turn arrived, the soldiers smiled at us and warmly welcomed us back to Israel. Needless to say, what I saw with ICAD and these days trips could not have been more different from what I saw on Birthright. So when I got back, I was really determined to do something and felt very like I had a responsibility to do something as a Jew. So I founded with my friend the chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace at Columbia, and it sort of blew up. And we went from just the two of us to now it's a pretty large organization that has provided a home for students, Jewish students who don't fit into the mainstream Jewish community there, which is very explicitly Zionist. We were able to do lots of different protests that got some media attention. We sort of ended up in some of like the Jewish newspapers in the city, and it just sort of it changed my life because I ended up on websites and with titles like Jihad Watch and other things like that. And it's been a lot. I'm lucky that I haven't had any sort of difficulty as a result, but it is a source of anxiety and something I think that all of you should be aware of as you think about the effect that this advocacy has on people. I mean, it's not safe for some people. For us, we deal with those consequences and we have the ability to sort of mitigate them. But there are Palestinians who they can't go visit their family anymore because they've spoken out once, and they end up on this website, which the IDF uses to prevent people like Emily from attending, from traveling there. So that being said, I've still felt a responsibility to sort of, I have the ability to take on that risk, and so I'm going to do it. And that led me to founding Jewish Voice for Peace. And now I'll just read sort of some reflections that I have after these experiences. And now it's been almost like a decade of me doing this. And this is where I'm at right now. My path has touched on every stratum of the Zionist spectrum. I started off enamored with Israel and the belonging that my birthright trip provided me. I made a pit stop in liberal Zionism, against the occupation, but okay with the maintenance of Jewish privilege in Israel. And finally, I left Zionism altogether. Let me be clear. I'm not non-Zionist. I am anti-Zionist. I cannot accept an ideology that calls for the perpetual dispossession of the Palestinian people so that I or any other Jewish person can enjoy unfettered access to privileges and resources in a state built on stolen land. The privileging of Jews over Palestinians in Israel-Palestine is not a mistake of Zionism. It is its goal. I can participate in this no more than I can in any other ideology that renders one group superior to another. Indeed, I have a responsibility as a member of the privileged group to dismantle the very idea that I should be prioritized. It's not enough for me to say I'm not a Zionist. I have to be absolutely opposed to the idea. This responsibility has become so wrapped up in my Jewish identity that there really isn't a distinction anymore. I can't ignore Zionism. It's too embedded in modern Jewish identity. I obviously won't accept it, and I certainly won't give up the Jewish identity I've worked so hard to cultivate. Thus, if I am to continue to participate in Judaism, I must oppose Zionism. Anything less, and I'd be a hypocrite, complicit in the injustice I've described. I'm lucky to have had people guide me toward this conclusion. It's a frightening thing to stand against a dominant trend in your community, perhaps more so when presumptions questioning your membership already exist. Introducing yourself as Christopher does raise some eyebrows from time to time. Without the bravery of other dissenting Jews, I probably wouldn't have found a home in the Jewish community. I would have missed out on the richness of half my heritage and the opportunity to fight for something important. I hope that other young Jews are so fortunate. I hope that my path can help guide others finding their own way, and that in the end, we will have played a small role in reorienting our community towards justice. Thanks.
I hope you'll agree that these are both wonderful narratives, and there are many more like it in Reclaiming Judaism from Zionism. So we're open to questions now.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank each of you for your really thoughtful discussions about your own personal transformation and the commitment of your time to sharing that with other people like us so that we can learn from that. And want to welcome questions from everybody. I did find the hand raising icon. It's at the bottom of your screen under reactions. If you click on that and then click on hand, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you. You can also submit a question into the chat room and we'll take questions that way as well. I'd like to start with one question out of many that I thought of listening to your presentation. And mine is looking at a part of the book. I think it was in the last chapter of the book. Carolyn, in your chapter, you talked about how otherwise socially progressive American Jews adopt Zionism or Zionist views that exclude consideration of Palestinian perspectives. And that's something just, I have to say, is somebody who's been around and kind of covering the Middle East as a Middle East analyst professionally, and engaged on these issues personally, that I've also noticed. And so I want to frame this in the sense that we're in a great time of change, or at least potential change right now. This was already the coronavirus was going to change a lot of things, but more fundamentally to this issue, what's going on in our country right now regarding social justice, things are going to change. We don't know how, but my question is that progressive people want racial justice here in America, and I just wonder if you see any signs of going to this question of Jews who are otherwise progressive but not on Palestine. Are there, do you see their views changing, or hope for that to happen?
I'm hoping very much that that they will change, because of course what happened to George Floyd happens to Palestinians all the time in the occupied territories. The racism, the structural racism in the U.S. is this very similar, if not identical, with the kind of racism that there is in Israel. One difference is that Jews are really fear of the Holocaust and fear of a recurring Holocaust is something that almost every Jewish child is brought up with, and the idea that only Israel can save us from that is so deeply entrenched. And the idea that somehow questioning this endangers the whole Jewish community and opens the door to another Holocaust. These are some of the things that really cause otherwise progressive people to compartmentalize. And I was struck over and over, for instance, right after Trump's election, there were all of these protests against the Muslim ban. And I saw a number of self-identified Jewish groups protesting, including Trua, a group of rabbis for human rights. And yet, when you point out that there is a Muslim ban essentially in Israel too, people don't want to hear it, and say that you're mixing things up. You're distracting from the struggle for justice. I think that things are changing so much that I'm really hoping that the kind of change of consciousness, and especially the determination to do something that we're seeing among young whites here in these demonstrations, and that certainly young Jews are very much a part of. I'm hoping that this will contribute to opening people's eyes and enabling people to talk about Israel, especially the partnership of Netanyahu and Trump, which is so clear. I think that something similar happening in Israel is a very long way off, if anything, because the brainwashing and the fear is really ingrained from kindergarten on. But here in the U.S., we don't have quite that amount of brainwashing, and I'm hoping that the moment that we're in will stimulate a lot of young Jews to make that connection, which certainly Jewish Voice for Peace has been making for quite a while, between the treatment of African Americans here and other minorities and the treatment of Palestinians in Israel, and the fact that our police forces are sent to Israel for training in anti-terrorism, and the rubber bullets and the tear gas and the other things that have been on the front page of the New York Times, and that many city councils are beginning to question. I mean, these are things that are practiced all the time, every day in Israel.
Thanks, Carolyn. I see Julia has a question, and then John Angst. Julia, do you want to go ahead?
You actually asked the same question I had. So you can go on to John. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I should have asked Emily and Chris, did you want to add anything to
Thank you.
What Carolyn said?
I would add two things. One, in terms of sort of the Jewish perspective changing around this. I think there's a lot more change that needs to happen, as Carolyn said. I also think, for me, I became really involved in sort of fighting for Palestinian rights in 2006, so a while ago. And the transformation that I've seen in Jewish individuals speaking out more about this has been incredibly huge from that time. And part of that is the work of JVP and really giving, it's not that there weren't Jewish people in 2006 that felt similar to me, but there wasn't as much of a platform for us to feel like we had a community and feel like we had a way to speak out that was safe. And so I think that there has been a huge, in the last 15 years almost, there's been a huge change in the ability for Jewish people to speak out on this. And I think that it feels like there's a lot more people who feel this way because of that. And I think also this moment, I think what's really important about this moment is what Carolyn said about connecting what we're seeing here with what's going on there, because it's very similar, and there's a lot of connections that can be made in terms of the systems that are behind what's happening here and the systems that are behind what's happening there. And I'm going to give a shameless plug, but my organization, Eyewitness Palestine, is actually hosting a all-day virtual summit on July 18th, talking about the connections between racial justice in the US and Palestine. And I think, and JVP is one of the co-sponsors, because I think they're trying to also make sure that that folks, sort of in the opposite way, that are not only fighting for Palestinian rights and not fighting for racial justice here in the US as well. And so I think I'm happy I'll put the link to that summit in the chat. It's open to anyone who would like to join, and we'll really be looking at all different issues that sort of connect the racial justice issues here with Palestine and Israel.
Yeah, I think I have a little bit to build on that, and it's about, like, fair warning, it's about to get real leftist over here, so just, prepare yourself. But I think they're both correct that there's, if you look at the Jewish community and broadly over the last, few decades, there's a huge amount of change. What I worry about a little bit right now is the illusion of change, and I think it's a danger in both the context of racial justice in the United States and in justice in Palestine, where I think as many Jews as there are or may be who are sort of moving to our position, I think there are far more who maybe were unquestioning, and if they're changing at all, they're going to this middle untenable liberal Zionist phase where they're very opposed to the occupation. They don't like Netanyahu. They don't want annexation to happen. And yet they don't look deeper. And I think the same thing happens in the United States, right? Where you have, and I think it's happened, maybe we're going to get past it this time. But I mean, if you look, I'm struck by how similar this moment is to, this has happened with like just cyclically for the last few years, where you have, police brutally murder a black man, Black Lives Matter protests, everyone's up in arms, and then it fizzles out, or people are like, no, all lives matter, or we can't do this, we can't do that. Maybe it's different this time. I just worry that if it's different but not different enough, we're just kicking the can down the road. Body cameras and trainings they don't address the fundamental issue, which is that police forces in the United States were designed to perpetuate the suppression, like the oppression of Black people after the end of slavery, to corral them into prisons where you are still allowed to use free labor. It's such a deep issue that goes to the very core of what the United States is in the post-Civil War sort of framework. If we don't address that, it's the same thing as if we don't address that Zionism by design cannot accommodate the national aspirations, the human rights of non-Jews who live in its territory. My hope is that the extreme sort of move to the right in Israel can have this sort of silver lining of, if the West Bank is annexed, the position of the end of the occupation becomes untenable. There is no occupation anymore. It's just part of Israel. And then you have to deal with the fact that half of your population is not represented by your government. I think this, it's a similar thing that's happening now. Maybe it's like, okay, this keeps happening. Clearly your solutions aren't working. We have to look deeper. If we don't do that, I'm not hopeful, but if we can do it, and I think that like the more we talk about Zionism and not the occupation, not what's happening on the ground, that's important. That's a good lens. That's a good starting point, but it has to go deeper. The same way that it's important to talk about George Floyd's, it's important to talk about these instances, but we have to talk about what animates these problems. Why does it keep happening? Why are our solutions not working? So there's progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Bravo.
Thank you. Just want to move to some questions in the chat room here. And one from Carolyn DuPont. How has your book been received? And have you had a chance to speak at temples as well as churches? And thank you for the interesting conversation.
Well, thank you for that question. It's been received quite well. It's been selling quite well, and I've received many, many invitations like yours today. Alas, I've only once been able to speak at a synagogue, and that once was because one of my contributors, Elise Cohen, belonged to that synagogue and fought tooth and nail to get us into it. And her rabbi proposed all sorts of other solutions, and she wouldn't have them. And so finally we were able to speak, she and I, to members of her synagogue, and that went very well. My effort to get into other synagogues has simply not happened. People have been put off by the title of the book. People are afraid. I mean, even synagogues that have a lot of members, JVP members, are afraid of provoking a split between the JVP members and the others. So I've made many attempts to speak in other in liberal synagogues, but so far that hasn't happened. On the other hand, Students for Justice in Palestine and campus JVP chapters have been very eager to have us present at them. And one of our sessions got canceled because of COVID, but I'm hopeful that that will continue.
Thank you. I do have a question from Anne here, and you may have touched on this a little bit in the previously, but just if there's anything more to say about whether there's growing sentiment in Israel that along the lines of the transformational journey that you, Emily, and Chris and your other co-authors have shared. You see that emerging in Israel itself.
I think perhaps Emily can best answer that. I mean, let me just briefly say that the people I read, like Gideon Levy, the columnist for Haaretz, are very, very pessimistic. I've met wonderful young activists here in organizations trying to bring about change in Israel. All of them are very pessimistic, and many of the progressives are leaving Israel and just finding life there impossible. But I think Emily has more of a connection with people in Israel than I do, and she can perhaps say more about this.
Thanks. I can try. I mean, I think what you said is very true. I mean, I think there are pieces of society where you do see some change happening. There's a very slow moving and still very tiny movement of young individuals to refuse to join the Israeli army. And you see cycles of that happening where, 20 high school seniors will sign a letter and say they're not willing to join, or 50 will do that one year. And more individuals are refusing to join in various ways. A lot of times it's not very publicly, and they're able to get out of army duty, which is required by every citizen, through like psychological exams and things like that. So they're not taking a political stand, but they're also, because if you do, there is no conscientious objector status basically in Israel. And so you go to prison if you take a political stance. So a lot of folks choose not to do that. And there's a much larger community of people doing that, which to me is a positive thing. But it's still tiny. The folks that are really doing it in a political statement to try and change the political atmosphere. I think also something that we've seen in maybe the last decade, but especially in the last, I would say 5 to 6 years, is a lot of more leftist Israelis leaving Israel and just being fed up. And I know the community in Jerusalem that was much more cohesive, a lot of folks there have left. And there's not a huge community in Jerusalem anymore. There's a little bit bigger community in Tel Aviv. So, I think there are areas where it's still happening and people are still trying, but the community, I wouldn't say the community of those folks that are really calling for a just peace is growing at all at this point. And it's, in fact, I think it may be shrinking, and it's pretty sad. I was just on a call on Thursday with an activist in Hebron who was asked the same question, and he said, we don't see Israelis coming to us as much. Like there's not as many people that are fighting for us anymore. And so that was really hard to hear that they're feeling that way as well.
I would just add quickly that I think it needs to be, whenever this question, I'm very pessimistic of this. I have Israeli friends who either objected and I mean, I know someone who served prison time or who just ended up having to do it and then sort of was like, I'm out of here afterwards to serve in the military. I mean, I don't think change will come from within Israel. It just won't happen. I mean, I don't think it came from within South Africa. It's not going to come from within Israel. It didn't come from within Rhodesia. I don't like it. It's not. These systems don't change from within. You need external pressure. And I just want to note that it can't be forgotten that Israeli society is not normal. It is not a normal democratic society. These children are in segregated schools where they are taught to count tanks. Like, it is literally like 1 dove, 2 olive branches, 3 tanks. Like, peace and war, they're the same. There is no difference. You will, when you turn 18, join the army and you will fight and occupy. Like, it is an extremely right-wing society. it's not easy. Sorry, my dogs are going crazy. It's not easy it's not a conducive environment for progressives to work in. That being said, they exist, like Emily and Carolyn said, but it's an uphill battle for sure. And you know, I don't blame people for just leaving. I mean, it's very hard and dangerous. It's not safe for people. You know, you can't just not go into the military if you're not exempt. You're going to go to jail. Just like, that's a lot to ask of somebody. So yeah, you need external pressure.
Okay, thank you. Jay reminds me that John Angst had a question. So John, over to you to ask your question.
Well, actually, my question was one that I was going to have Jay respond to. I wasn't expecting to be on camera, but if you can hear me. It was an observation, but it's a question. Is the genesis of this renewal of this effort, is it at a critical intersection with the fact is we have new generations? I can't even tell you what a generation X or a Y or Z or whatever it is now, but is there something that could be said for and I'd ask this of the younger contributors, is there something that can be said that the advocacy of a younger generation that's different than maybe the well-intentioned but ineffectual movements of my youth are in play? And if that is in fact the genesis of this, maybe that could be amplified by the contributors. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's no doubt that as you go down in age among the Jewish community, you will see more diversity of opinion on Israel. That's not to say that there are not, you know, elders within our community who have guided us and who have, you know, have built these spaces in which we operate. But there is, I think, a difference and a larger, I think it's more universal too. I think it goes beyond this issue. It's just a sort of, there is, I think that my generation and the generation, I think I'm a millennial, then there's Gen X, and then I don't know what the young people are today. That's a whole thing. The COVID generation, I guess. But I think there is a more universal, humanistic, less wrapped up in nationalism, less wrapped up in territory idea of what it means to live in a just world. So I do think that there is a movement to, with that as the goal, take an intersectional approach that unifies and operates through solidarity, through different groups that experience oppression in different ways, but all have the same undercurrent of you know, power, the power structure, in some way preventing them from living their lives the way that they should be able to. I do think that awareness is greater, and I am hopeful that there'll be more, but we have to learn, I think, like you very eloquently stated, like from these well-intended but not enough or like inadequate attempts to fix, to rectify these historic wrongs. And I think it goes back to what I said, and I, you know, to sound like a broken record, like we got to go deep. It's like the reason that the efforts in the past were inadequate is because they didn't go deep enough. Like it is at the very core of our society where these issues originate, and we have to dismantle it from the ground and start over. And, you know, and obviously practical considerations, and there's a million other ways we can say it, but we can't get bogged down in like this sort of, well, what do we do now? And like, who are you going to call if somebody's robbing your house? Because that's a thing that happens to everybody all the time. But it's, you know, we have to really dive deeply. And I do think that younger generations are more willing to do that.
Thank you. So we're really, we've gone a little bit over time, and we started late. I think we'll take one more question, and then I'm going to post the link to the book down at the bottom of the chat. But Beverly had a question about whether the panelists could talk about how Jews from Ethiopia are being treated in Israel. And I just want to add on to that, kind of whether that might be if there is kind of an awareness of a different treatment, whether recognition of that might lead to better treatment or kind of understanding of the way Palestinians are treated. Thank you.
Well, of course, Ethiopian Jews are treated with racism, and there was, a few months ago, there was a wonderful letter by an Ethiopian Jew talking about this that was circulated on the internet. The problem, as Chris says, one has to go deeper. First of all, Mizrahi Jews have been treated very, very badly. They are denied the kinds of resources that Ashkenazi Jews have had, and so Ethiopian Jews are yet another community that is being openly treated in a racist way. The racism is very, very widespread and very deep in Israeli society, as my Sephardi Mizrahi contributors in the book talk about in their narratives. But again, it's for some people, it will be a way for them to break out of Zionist ideology and to use their experiences to agitate against Zionism. But they so far have been a very, very small minority. It's more common to try to win privileges for yourself by accommodating in some way, by showing yourself to be a good Israeli, like a good American, join the military, do what's expected of you, that sort of thing. So that's my take on it. But again, I expect that Emily and probably Chris have different things to say about it.
I mean, I think the only thing I would add is, I think that Ethiopian Jews have been discriminated against since the moment they arrived. In fact, I know when I was at Ben Gurion University, one of our sort of counselors who was a mentor for us was Ethiopian, and she told me about her father's journey and how when he showed up, they were all told they had to convert to Judaism, which the majority of people in Israel are secular Jewish people. And most of the Ethiopians that were coming from Ethiopia at that time were actually more religious than most of the people in Israel. And so the fact that they were saying, oh, because your Judaism is not like the European Judaism that we, the people who run this country, are part of, you have to convert to our Judaism. And there was actually a huge uproar that her father was a part of to basically say, we will not convert to Judaism. We refuse to do that. We are already Jewish. And I think they ended up winning that battle. But that's just to say that, just like here, the, systematic racism goes back since the beginning. It's the same there. And it's directly ingrained in every part of the system. And there are various levels of sort of rights within Israel, depending on if you're Mizrahi or Ethiopian or different things there. And I would say in terms of if that could be dealt with, could then Palestine be something that's connected to that? I think right now what I've seen in not necessarily, well, even in a lot of the Mizrahi community in Israel is a want or need or a feeling that they have to disconnect themselves from Palestinians, because if they are in solidarity with Palestinians, then they're going to be seen in an even worse light. And so one of the groups of folks that I've seen this in a lot are African asylee seekers that are being incredibly oppressed in Israel right now and have been for a long time. We have our groups meet with them, and we had one group meet with them, and the person was talking about how Palestinians are not refugees. and went into a whole diatribe about what refugees are and how Palestinians are not that. And it was like, and a lot of it comes from, well, we want to be seen as the good members. We need to be seen as good members of society. And so we can't support what Israel is against because we just want to be treated equally in the society that we are living in. And I think that's a big problem. I think that if there was more solidarity between these communities, that that is where actually some change could come. But unfortunately, at this moment, we don't see that very much. Certainly, there are some who do, like in the 70s and 80s, there were the Israeli Black Panthers, who really took a lot of they were Mizrahi Jews who came from all over the Arab countries around Israel, and they took a lot of their inspiration from the Black Panthers in the US. And still today, they're not super active as an organization, but members of that are still incredibly supportive of Palestinian rights and speak out a lot around them. So, yeah.
I would just add quickly that I think that I think it's important to mention there's some legal stuff going on here where like it is, and I think it highlights the damage that Israel and Zionism does not only to Palestinians but to the global Jewish community, and an attempt to sort of collapse its diversity into one that is only reflected in Israel. Israel is, there's civil law, right? But there's a pseudo theocracy in Israel. The personal status law is governed not by Israeli civil law, but by rabbinical law, Orthodox rabbinical law. There's the chief rabbinate that determines all matters of personal status, marriage, and the definition of who is a Jew is very narrow. So Ethiopian Jews, while they may have access to resources from the civil government, they are drafted, they serve in the IDF and get access to all the resources that come with service. There are lots of restrictions on, like, for example, for me, right, even not like I'm Ashkenazi, but like if my father were Jewish and not my mother, I would have to convert if I wanted to get married in Israel. You can't, there is no such thing as a non-Orthodox marriage in Israel. There's civil unions, but marriage is only through Orthodox Judaism, and it isn't, and intermarriage, if you're not Orthodox, is prohibited. So all of these things affect Jews, that it's not only related, I think, to race, but it's also related to this intra-Jewish identity dispute that I sort of alluded to, that where it's very difficult if you don't fit into this very narrow vision of what a Jew is in Israel, which is very, very, very closely tied, I think, to very toxic and dangerous strains of white supremacy in the larger world. You don't get the resources that are advertised as being available to Jews. It's not so much the Jewish state as it is sort of the white Orthodox Ashkenazi state. But yeah, that's all.
Well, I want to thank Carolyn, Emily, and Chris so much for your time and your very personal and enlightening stories. I think it's really been a rich morning, and we really appreciate having you. For everyone, there's also a number of complimentary posts in the chat room as well. And if anybody still is looking for the book link, it's down near the bottom of the chat room. Thank you so much, everyone. And until the next time, enjoy the day.
Thank you so much for inviting us. It's been very stimulating. The questions have been great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.